The blizzard came without warning that January of 1878. Pa had gone to town for supplies, leaving Ma and me alone at the homestead. I was 13 then, gangly and restless, with hands too big for my wrists and a voice that cracked when I spoke. Ma had been quiet all morning, her fingers working the needle through a patch on my worn trousers while the wind began to moan around the corners of our cabin. The sound started low, like a wounded animal, before rising to a howl that rattled the shutters and sent cold drafts skittering across the plank floor. She set aside her mending when the first flakes began to fall. They were small and hard, like grains of sand against the window glass. Ma moved to the stove, stirring the beans that had been simmering since dawn, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. It was a beautiful thing, that shawl, deep red with intricate black embroidery along the edges, a gift from my grandfather, who'd traded with the Navajo years before. The color stood out stark against the graying walls of our home, like a splash of blood on winter snow. By midday, the world outside had disappeared behind a curtain of white. The temperature dropped so fast the water bucket by the door formed a skin of ice within the hour. Ma kept glancing toward the window, her lips pressed thin, waiting for some sign of Pa's return. Her hands were never still, kneading dough, sweeping the already clean floor, adjusting the lamp wicks. The worry lived in her movements, though her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Joseph," she said, using my given name the way she always did when something important was coming. "If your father isn't back by sundown, I'll need to check on the livestock." Her eyes held mine, serious and dark. "The animals won't survive the night without water and extra feed." I nodded, though the thought of her venturing out made my stomach tighten. The barn stood only 50 yards from our door, but in a blizzard, 50 yards might as well be 50 miles. The light began to fade early, filtered through clouds and snow until it took on the quality of pewter. Heavy, dull, oppressive. 4 o'clock came and went with no sign of Pa. Ma stood at the window, one hand pressed against the glass, as if she could push back the storm through will alone. The red shawl framed her face, catching the lamplight. "I'll go with you," I said, already reaching for my coat. She shook her head, firm in that way that left no room for argument. "Someone needs to keep the fire going," she said, tucking loose strands of hair beneath her woolen cap. "If your father makes it back while I'm out, he'll need warmth waiting." She wrapped the shawl tighter, knotting it securely at her waist. I watched as she pulled on Pa's spare gloves, too large for her slender hands. The leather swallowed her fingers, making them clumsy as she fastened her coat. She took the lantern down from its hook, the flame dancing wildly as she moved. "Bar the door behind me," she instructed, her breath visible in the cooling air of the cabin. "I'll knock 3 times when I return." Then she was gone, swallowed by white, before she'd taken 5 steps from the porch. The lantern light receded, a faint orange glow that seemed to hover, disembodied, before winking out entirely. I counted the minutes, then the hours. The knocks never came. Pa returned near midnight, half frozen and frantic when he found me alone. The search began immediately, neighbors summoned through the dying storm, lanterns cutting yellow paths through the thinning snow. They found nothing, no tracks, no sign of struggle, no body, just emptiness, as if the storm had simply erased her from the earth. For weeks afterward, I woke in the night believing I'd heard her voice calling from the yard. Pa would find me standing on the porch in my nightclothes, scanning the darkness for movement. "She's coming back," I'd insist, though his face told me he'd already accepted what I couldn't. By spring, when the search parties had long since given up, I still found myself watching the horizon, waiting for a flash of red against the greening prairie. The seasons cycled, pulling me further from that winter night. Pa never remarried, though the widow Simmons from over Blackwater Way brought casseroles every Sunday for nearly 2 years. He was polite but distant, as if part of him remained out in that storm, searching. I grew taller than him by my 16th birthday, my shoulders broadening with the work of maintaining our land. We rarely spoke of Ma, though her absence shaped every corner of our lives. The unmade curtains she'd planned for the front room, the garden that grew wild with neglect, the way Pa and I ate our meals in silence, where once there had been conversation. Sometimes I'd catch Pa staring at Ma's rocking chair, his eyes focused on something I couldn't see. The grief had settled into him like frost in deep soil, hardening him in ways I couldn't breach. He sold off half our cattle the year after she vanished, claiming it was too much work for two. But I knew the truth. The animals reminded him of her final moments, her purpose that night. I'd find him in the barn sometimes, running weathered fingers over her saddle, preserved exactly as she'd left it. Sheriff Donovan officially closed the investigation after 18 months. "Oh, likely she got disoriented in the whiteout," he explained, hat in hands, eyes averted from Pa's stony glare, wandered onto the prairie instead of toward the barn. Bodies have been known to disappear out there, coyotes, other scavengers. Pa nodded once, sharp as an axe blow, and showed the sheriff out. That night, I heard him weeping for the first and only time, the sound muffled through the thin wall separating our rooms. I left for Denver when I turned 20, unable to bear the weight of absence any longer. The homestead had become a monument to what we'd lost, every corner haunted not by Ma's ghost, but by the crushing reality of her absence. Pa said little when I packed my things, just pressed a folded wad of bills into my palm and told me there would always be a place for me if I wanted it. His hair had gone completely grey by then, his back beginning to stoop under the invisible burden he carried. The city swallowed me whole, its noise and bustle a welcome distraction from the silence I'd grown up with. I found work as a clerk in a mercantile, then later as a bookkeeper for the railroad. Numbers made sense to me, orderly, predictable, unlike the chaotic way fate had torn through my family. I wrote to Pa every month, and he replied with short, practical letters detailing rainfall and crop yields, never once mentioning the empty space at our table. Years passed this way, until the telegram came on a crisp autumn morning in 1888. Pa had taken ill, pneumonia, the doctor said. I boarded the eastbound train that afternoon, watching the city dissolve into farmland, then prairie, the landscape of my childhood rolling past the window like pages of a book I'd tried to close. The homestead appeared smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling, the roof in need of repair. Pa lay wasted in Ma's old bed, his breathing shallow, eyes bright with fever. He rallied briefly when he saw me, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "You look like her," he whispered, though I'd always favored his side of the family. "Around the eyes." We talked through the night, more words exchanged in those hours than in all the years after Ma vanished. As dawn broke, he turned to me, suddenly urgent. "I never stopped looking," he confessed. "Every new fence line, every creek bed, every time I rode the property, hoping to find something." Pa died 3 days later, slipping away in his sleep while I dozed in the chair beside him. I buried him behind the house, next to the empty plot he'd marked for Ma 10 years earlier. Standing there, shovel in hand, dirt under my nails, I realized I was truly alone, the last witness to our small family tragedy, the only keeper of memories that would die with me. I decided then to sell the property, to let it pass to someone unburdened by its history. As I packed up the house, sorting through the accumulated debris of 2 lives, one interrupted, one completed, I found myself separating items into piles, to sell, to keep, to burn. Ma's few possessions Pa had preserved exactly as she'd left them, her hairbrush still holding strands of dark hair, her reading glasses folded on the Bible, her recipe box with cards in her flowing script. Each item I touched seemed to pulse with the echo of her fingers, until I could almost believe she'd just stepped out and would return at any moment. The sale of the homestead proceeded quickly. Land in that part of Nebraska had become valuable. with the railroad spur now extending past what had once been wilderness. The banker handling the transaction seemed puzzled by my haste, but counted out the bills without comment. I took only what would fit in 2 trunks: photographs, Pa's pocket watch, Ma's Bible. The rest went to auction, scattered to strangers who knew nothing of the story behind each object. I returned to Denver with no intention of ever going back. The city had changed in my absence, grown taller, louder, more certain of itself. I found my old position filled, but secured new work with an insurance company. The days developed a rhythm: wake, work, eat, sleep. Occasionally I'd meet colleagues for drinks or attend a theatre performance, but mostly I kept to myself. Some nights I'd wake suddenly, certain I'd heard the wind howling around a cabin that now belonged to someone else. The letter arrived in late 1889, forwarded from my previous address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper cheap, but the words carefully formed. It was from Elijah Walsh, who'd purchased our old property. He wrote formally, almost apologetically, explaining that while clearing the south pasture for additional planting, his workers had found something I might want to know about. My heart lurched at the final paragraph. Caught in the barbed wire fence along Crooked Creek, about a mile from the homestead, we discovered a woman's shawl, red wool with black stitching. Very old, but remarkably preserved. I recalled the story about your mother's disappearance and thought perhaps... The paper shook in my hands. 10 years. 10 years since the storm had swallowed her whole, and now this, a scrap of fabric that might be nothing, might be everything. I requested leave from my employer the next morning and was on the eastbound train by noon, the rhythm of the wheels beneath me beating out a question I'd never stopped asking. What happened to her? What happened to her? What happened to her? Walsh met me at the station, a stocky man with honest eyes and calloused hands. Didn't touch it much, he explained as his wagon carried us toward what had once been my home. Left it where we found it mostly. Seemed right somehow. We spoke little on the journey, the March wind sharp against our faces. I studied the landscape, so familiar yet altered, new fences cutting across what had been open range, an expanded barn where our modest structure had stood, fields ploughed in different patterns than Pa had followed. The fence line came into view as we crested a small rise. Walsh pulled the wagon to a stop, pointing toward a bend in the creek where 3 strands of rusted barbed wire stretched between weathered posts. There, he said simply. I climbed down, legs unsteady beneath me, and approached slowly. From a distance, it looked like a splash of blood against the dull brown of winter grass. Drawing closer, I could make out the familiar pattern, the black embroidery along the edges, now faded but unmistakable. The shawl hung suspended, tangled in the barbs as if caught mid-flight. Parts had rotted away, but substantial pieces remained, protected somewhat by the position, draped rather than lying on the damp ground. I reached out, hesitated, then gently touched the fabric. It was stiff with age and exposure, but undeniably the same shawl Ma had wrapped around herself that night. My fingers traced the embroidery, each stitch a memory of her hands working by lamplight during long winter evenings. Questions flooded through me as I stood there. How had it come to be here, a full mile from our barn? Had she become disoriented in the blizzard, wandered in the wrong direction? Or had she made it to the animals, tended them as she'd planned, only to lose her way on the return journey? I imagined her struggling through deepening snow, the wind stealing her breath, visibility reduced to nothing. Had she called out for help? Had she thought of me, waiting by the fire? Had she known she was walking away from safety rather than toward it? Walsh hung back, giving me privacy with this relic of my past. Eventually, he cleared his throat. "There's more," he said, eyes averted. "Might be nothing, but..." He led me downstream about 30 yards to where the creek bent sharply around a stand of cottonwoods. My boy found it last fall, digging for fishing worms. He pointed to an eroded section of bank where spring runoff had carved away layers of soil. Something pale gleamed against the dark earth. My breath caught. Bones. Small, delicate, the curve of what might be a finger, the angle of what could be a wrist. Time and water had done their work, leaving little to identify. But I knew with devastating certainty who I was looking at. The creek had shifted course over the years, cutting deeper into its banks, revealing what the storm and subsequent searches had concealed. Ma had never made it to the barn that night. She'd been heading in entirely the wrong direction, perhaps turned around by the blinding snow, and had come here instead. I spent the night at Walsh's home, his wife quietly attentive, their children stealing curious glances at the stranger whose story they'd clearly heard. Sleep eluded me as I lay in their spare room, staring at the ceiling, the shawl, carefully wrapped in clean muslin, resting on the chair beside the bed. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would take Ma home. Properly this time, to rest beside Pa in the plot he'd reserved for her all those years. The sheriff was called, formalities observed. Doc Peterson, grey now but still serving the county, confirmed what we already knew. The remains were human, likely female, consistent with someone missing for a decade. No foul play evident, just the simple tragedy of a woman caught in a blizzard, perhaps falling through ice, weakened by the storm, or simply succumbing to cold, so intense it would have stopped her heart within hours. The official finding: accidental death. We held a small service 2 days later. Some of the old neighbours came. The Hendricks, old Mrs. Fowler, even Widow Simmons, her hair now white, her back bent with age. Most spoke of Ma as if she'd just passed, not 10 years ago, sharing memories of her kindness, her garden, the preserves she'd bring to community gatherings. I stood silent, feeling like an imposter at my own mother's funeral. These people had known her daily, carried her memory all this time, while I had fled, trying to outrun the pain of her absence. That evening, alone in the cemetery as twilight gathered, I sat beside the fresh-turned earth and spoke to her for the first time since that night. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, telling her about Pa's decline, my life in Denver, the emptiness that had followed me, no matter how far I traveled. I described Pa's devotion, how he'd never stopped looking, never stopped believing he might find some trace of her. He loved you until his last breath, I said to the darkening air, and I've never stopped missing you. Walsh invited me to stay as long as I needed. I ended up remaining for 2 weeks, walking the property daily, retracing what must have been Ma's final journey. The fence where the shawl was found had been erected years after her disappearance, the barbs catching and preserving this fragment of her passage like an unintentional memorial. Standing there, I could almost see her, disoriented, the snow blinding, each step becoming heavier as cold seeped into her bones. Had she known she was walking toward the creek rather than the barn? Had she realized her mistake before the end? I found myself drawn repeatedly to the spot where her remains had been discovered. The spring runoff had carved deeper into the bank, revealing more with each passing day, a button from her coat, a corroded buckle from her boot. I gathered these fragments carefully, each one a piece of the puzzle I'd been assembling for a decade. The creek murmured constantly, as if trying to tell me something just beyond my understanding. Before I left, Walsh showed me one more thing, something he'd been uncertain about sharing. From a drawer in his desk, he withdrew a small cloth pouch. Found this wedged between 2 rocks in the creek bed, not far from where she was, he explained, his voice gentle. Water must have carried it there, preserved it somehow. Inside was Ma's wedding ring, the simple gold band Pa had saved 3 months to buy. I recognized it instantly. She'd never taken it off in life. The discovery broke something loose inside me. That night, Alone in the room where I'd once slept as a boy, I wept for the first time since her disappearance. Not the bewildered tears of a child, but the deep, knowing grief of a man who finally understood the truth. She had died alone in the cold, perhaps calling for help that never came. While I waited by the fire, while Pa struggled through the dying storm, she had already been lost to us, claimed by the darkness and the snow. I left the next morning, the shawl and ring carefully packed among my belongings. The train carried me westward, but my mind remained in that creek bed, piecing together her final hours. The facts were clear now, but the weight of them felt impossible to bear. For 10 years, I'd lived with uncertainty, the torturous hope that somehow, somewhere, she might still be alive. Now that hope was gone, replaced by a different kind of pain, sharper, but somehow cleaner. In Denver, I resigned from my position and sold most of my possessions. The city had never truly been home, just a place to hide from memories. With no clear destination in mind, I purchased a ticket to San Francisco, thinking perhaps the ocean might provide the vastness needed to contain my grief. The journey west took 5 days, the landscape changing dramatically outside my window. Plains giving way to mountains, then arid plateaus, finally the lush valleys of California. San Francisco embraced me with fog and salt air, so different from the dry prairie winds of my youth. I found lodging in a modest boarding house near the waterfront, where the constant activity of the harbor provided distraction. For weeks, I wandered the city, learning its rhythms, the way hills revealed and concealed views of the bay, how light changed the color of the water from slate to sapphire throughout the day. Slowly, I began to breathe easier, as if the maritime air was clearing something stagnant from my lungs. The shawl remained wrapped in muslin, tucked in my trunk. Some nights I would take it out, running my fingers over the fabric, trying to connect with the woman who had worn it. The texture brought back memories. Ma teaching me to read by lamplight, her finger tracing words on the page. Ma kneading bread dough, flour dusting her forearms. Ma singing softly while she mended. Old songs from her own childhood. These recollections came clearer now, no longer shadowed by the mystery of her fate. I found work as a bookkeeper for a shipping company, my days filled with manifests and invoices, numbers that balanced neatly at day's end. My employer, Mr. Harrington, was a widower himself, and perhaps recognized something in my demeanor that spoke of loss. He invited me to Sunday dinners, introduced me to his circle of friends, drew me gradually into the life of the city. For the first time since leaving the homestead, I felt the possibility of belonging somewhere. Among Harrington's acquaintances was Elizabeth Chen, a quiet woman who managed a small library near Chinatown. Her father American, her mother Chinese, she navigated between worlds with grace I envied. We began taking lunch together occasionally, then attending concerts, eventually sharing dinners at small restaurants where she would order in Cantonese, laughing gently at my clumsy attempts to pronounce the dishes. She never pressed when conversations faltered, seeming to understand that some silences needed to be honored. One evening, walking her home after a symphony performance, I found myself telling her about Ma, not just her disappearance, but who she had been in life. The way she could predict weather changes from the behavior of birds, how she kept a journal of dreams, believing they contained messages if properly interpreted, her habit of saving the first blossom of each plant in her garden, pressing it between Bible pages as a token of gratitude. Elizabeth listened without interruption, her arm linked through mine, her presence steady as a heartbeat. When I finished speaking, we had reached her door, but neither moved to part. "She sounds remarkable," Elizabeth said finally, "someone who noticed the world closely." Then, with unexpected insight, "You have that quality too, observation. It's what makes you good with numbers, I think. Seeing patterns others miss." The comment startled me, not just the comparison to Ma, but the realization that this woman had been studying me as carefully as I studied balance sheets. That night, I dreamed of the creek for the first time, not as it had been when they found Ma, but as it might have looked the night she disappeared. In the dream, I stood on the bank, watching snow swirl across black water. A figure moved through the storm toward me, red shawl billowing. I called out, but no sound came. The figure paused, seemed about to turn toward my voice, then continued on, fading into whiteness. I woke with tears on my face, but the ache in my chest felt different, less raw, more like an old injury that twinges before rain. Spring arrived, bringing renewal to the city, window boxes erupting with color, market stalls overflowing with produce, the bay dotted with more sales as weather improved. Elizabeth and I spent weekends exploring, climbing hills for panoramic views, visiting galleries and bookshops, sampling foods I'd never encountered in Nebraska or Colorado. Slowly, cautiously, I began to imagine a future rather than dwelling in the past, a shift so gradual I hardly noticed until it had already occurred. On the 10th anniversary of finding Ma's shawl, I took the day off work and carried the wrapped bundle to the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. The ocean stretched endless before me, waves breaking against rocks far below, seabirds wheeling in currents of air. I sat for hours, watching the water change colors with the moving sun, thinking about time and distance, how a decade could feel both vast and compressed, how thousands of miles could separate you from your past, yet never truly sever the connection. As sunset approached, I unwrapped the shawl one final time. The fabric had continued to deteriorate despite my care, becoming more fragile with each passing year. Parts crumbled at my touch, returning to component threads as if surrendering to time's inevitable progress. I lifted it carefully, letting the wind catch the edges, making the faded embroidery dance in the fading light. Then, with a whispered goodbye, I released it to the air. The red wool caught the breeze, billowed briefly like a flag, then was carried out over the water, pieces separating, drifting, until they disappeared from sight, not gone, just transformed, becoming part of something larger than themselves. Elizabeth and I married in the spring of 1892, a small ceremony overlooking the bay. Harrington hosted the reception at his home, his booming laugh and generous hospitality, creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration. For a wedding gift, Elizabeth presented me with a hand-bound book, blank pages waiting to be filled. For memories, she explained, both past and future. That night, I made my first entry, not about our wedding, but about Ma, a description of her hands, capable and gentle, the way they looked kneading bread or braiding my hair when I was small. Our life together developed its own rhythm and texture. We found a small house with a garden where Elizabeth planted herbs and flowers, some familiar from my childhood, others exotic to my prairie-trained eyes. Weekends were spent exploring the coastline or browsing bookshops where Elizabeth would read passages aloud in her clear, measured voice. I continued with the shipping company, eventually becoming a partner when Harrington decided to semi-retire. The work suited me, orderly, predictable, with occasional challenges that required creative solutions. In 1894, our daughter was born. Small, perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. We named her Lillian, after Ma. Holding her, I was struck by the continuity of life, how something of Ma lived on not just in memory, but in flesh and blood. Elizabeth recovered slowly from the birth, pale and tired for months afterward. I would bring the baby to her in bed, watching as she nursed, her face serene despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. Fatherhood changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each milestone in Lillian's development, her first smile, first step, first word, felt like a miracle witnessed. I found myself telling her stories about the homestead, about Pa's patience with skittish horses, about Ma's garden and her red shawl. These tales became bedtime rituals, repeated and embellished, until they took on the quality of family mythology. Through retelling, the sharp edges of grief wore smooth, like creek stones tumbled by current. As Lillian grew, I saw echoes of Ma in unexpected moments. The way she would pause to watch birds in flight, her serious concentration when learning a new skill, her habit of humming under her breath while engaged in a task. These similarities both comforted and unsettled me. I found myself overprotective, anxious when she was out of sight, plagued by visions of her vanishing like Ma had. Elizabeth noticed, of course. She is her own person, she reminded me gently, not a ghost or a replacement, just herself. The turn of the century brought changes to San Francisco. More automobiles on the streets, electric lights replacing gas in businesses and homes, a sense of acceleration toward an unknown future. Lillian thrived in this environment of progress, devouring books, asking endless questions about how things worked, why customs existed, what lay beyond the horizon. I tried to answer honestly, even when the questions touched on difficult subjects. "What happened to your mother?" she asked once. Direct as only a child can be, I told her the truth, in language appropriate to her age, watching her face as she processed this fragment of her heritage. In April of 1906, the earth shook us awake before dawn. The quake lasted less than a minute, but transformed the city instantly, chimneys toppling, water mains rupturing, gas lines breaking. By noon, fires had started that would consume entire districts. We joined the exodus of survivors, carrying what we could salvage, making our way to the temporary camps established in parks and open spaces. For 3 days, we watched from a distance as flames devoured neighborhoods, including our own. The devastation triggered memories of that winter storm, the way natural forces could rewrite lives in moments. I found myself checking constantly for Elizabeth and Lillian, panic rising whenever they moved from sight. At night, in our makeshift tent, I would wake from nightmares of searching, endless walking through snow or ash or rubble, calling names that echoed unanswered. Elizabeth would hold me then, her body warm against mine, anchoring me to the present. "We're here," she would whisper. "We're safe." In the rebuilding that followed, we decided to leave the city. The shipping company had suffered significant losses, and at 41, I felt too old to start over in the same industry. Elizabeth suggested we move north, to a small coastal town where her mother's cousin operated an apothecary and needed help with the business. The change would be dramatic, from urban bustle to rural quiet, but something in me responded to the idea of open space, of distance between buildings, of horizons visible rather than blocked by structures. We arrived in Mendocino in late summer, the journey by stagecoach taking us through redwood forests that made me feel small in a way even the ocean hadn't managed. The town itself perched on headlands above the Pacific, its wooden buildings weathered by salt air, its pace dictated by tides and seasons rather than commerce. Cousin Chen welcomed us with quiet dignity, showing us to the apartment above the shop that would be our home until we found something more permanent. The transition from city to small-town life proved easier than anticipated. The apothecary thrived under Elizabeth's management, her knowledge of both Western medicine and traditional Chinese remedies attracting a diverse clientele. Lillian enrolled in the local school, initially shy but soon forming friendships with local children. I kept the books for the business, and gradually took on other accounting work for merchants in town. Our routines settled into a pleasant predictability, marked by the changing light across water, the migration of whales offshore, the shifting colors of coastal wildflowers. We found a small house on the edge of town, overlooking a cove where fishing boats sheltered during storms. The property included enough land for Elizabeth to expand her herb garden, experimenting with what would grow in the coastal climate. I built raised beds following her design and found unexpected satisfaction in the physical labor. The scent of turned earth, the grain of wood under my hands, the tangible results of effort. Sometimes, working there, I would think of Pa and his careful tending of our Nebraska fields, understanding his connection to the land in ways I hadn't as a younger man. One autumn afternoon, walking the headlands alone, I came across an old barn weathered to silver, its doors hanging askew, roof partially collapsed. Something about its abandonment called to me, perhaps echoes of our Nebraska barn, perhaps simply the challenge of resurrection. I inquired in town and discovered the property had been vacant for years, the owner living in San Diego with no interest in the land beyond nominal tax payments. A letter, an offer, a response, and suddenly I owned 5 acres of coastal property, including the dilapidated structure. Restoration became my project, hours stolen from mornings and evenings, full days when weather permitted. I replaced rotted supports, reshingled the roof, rehung doors that swung true on new hinges. Elizabeth questioned the purpose occasionally, but seemed to understand my need to rebuild something solid, to create shelter where there had been ruin. Lillian helped on weekends, learning to drive nails, sand rough boards, apply linseed oil to weather-beaten wood. Her hands grew calloused like mine, her questions about technique revealing a mind that grasped structural principles intuitively. The barn's renovation coincided with changes in Lillian herself, the gradual transformation from child to young woman. At 15, she had Ma's height and Elizabeth's grace, with a quickness of mind that belonged uniquely to her. She spoke of college, of cities she wanted to explore, ambitions that would take her far from our coastal town. I listened with pride tinged by apprehension, aware that loving her meant preparing for her departure, just as my parents had prepared for mine. The spring Lillian turned 16, I completed the barn restoration. To celebrate, we held a gathering there, neighbors, friends, Elizabeth's relatives who had gradually moved north to join us over the years. Lanterns hung from rafters, tables laden with food stretched along one wall. A local trio played fiddle and mandolin in the corner, watching Lillian dance, her dark hair coming loose from its pins. I was struck by the fullness of the moment, joy unmarred by the shadows that had followed me for so long. Later that night, after guests had departed and Elizabeth had gone ahead to the house, Lillian and I sat on the barn steps, watching stars emerge above the cypress trees that marked our property line. "Dad," she said suddenly, "tell me about grandmother Lillian again. Not the sad part, what she was like before." The request surprised me. She'd heard these stories countless times, but I complied, describing Ma's laugh, her stubbornness, the songs she sang while working. When I finished, Lillian was quiet for so long I thought she might have fallen asleep sitting up. Finally, she turned to me, her expression serious in the dimming lantern light. "I've been thinking about Nebraska," she said, "and about seeing where you grew up, where she disappeared, where she was found." My chest tightened at the idea. I hadn't returned since identifying Ma's remains 20 years earlier. "Would you take me there?" she asked. "Before I apply to colleges, I think I need to know that part of our history." The request burrowed into me, impossible to dismiss. For weeks afterward, I found myself waking at night, remembering details of the homestead I thought I'd forgotten, the exact squeak of the porch step, the way light fell through kitchen windows in late afternoon, the smell of sage after rain. Elizabeth watched me wrestling with the decision, offered neither encouragement nor discouragement, understanding this was something I needed to resolve alone. By midsummer, I had made my choice. I wrote to the county records office, confirming that Walsh still owned the property, then composed a letter asking permission to visit with my daughter. His reply came promptly. Not only permission, but an invitation to stay at the main house, now substantially enlarged from the modest structure I remembered. The property had prospered under his management, he wrote, and it would be his honor to show us the improvements while respecting the significance the land held for us. We made plans to travel in August, when the apothecary business slowed and before Lillian's final year of school began. Elizabeth chose to remain behind, sensing perhaps that this journey belonged to Lillian and me alone. As departure approached, I found myself increasingly restless, packing and repacking my bag, checking train schedules obsessively, waking from dreams of prairie storms and barbed wire fences. The past, which had receded to comfortable distance over decades, suddenly loomed immediate and demanding. The journey east felt like moving backward through my own history, San Francisco to Denver, Denver to Omaha, finally the local line to the small station where Walsh had met me 20 years earlier. The landscape grew increasingly familiar as we traveled, the coastal mountains giving way to desert, then plains, until we were surrounded by the ocean of grass that had been the backdrop to my childhood. Lillian pressed her face to the train window, absorbing this new terrain, occasionally asking questions about farming practices or weather patterns she observed. Walsh's son met us at the station, a man my age, though we had never met during my previous visit. He had his father's steady gaze and direct manner, explaining that the elder Walsh had passed 3 years earlier, leaving the expanded operation to his children. "Father spoke often of your family's history here," he said, as his automobile bounced along roads that had once been rutted wagon tracks. "I made sure we all understood the importance of remembering those who worked this land before us." The homestead was unrecognizable at first glance, the original cabin long gone, replaced by a substantial 2-story home with a wide veranda. New outbuildings clustered around a central yard, painted uniformly white with green trim. Only the cottonwoods along the creek remained unchanged, their massive trunks and spreading branches a living link to my past. I stood motionless in the yard, disoriented by the collision of memory and present reality, while Lillian watched me with quiet concern. Mrs. Walsh welcomed us with prairie hospitality, a laden table, fresh-baked bread, rooms prepared with crisp linens and wildflowers in glass jars. Their children, mostly grown, asked polite questions about California, about our journey, carefully avoiding mention of what had brought us here. After the meal, Walsh suggested we might want to rest, but I found myself restless, drawn to the windows facing south, toward where our barn had stood, where the fateful blizzard had begun its work of erasure. The next morning, Walsh offered to show us the property. "Father maintained the memorial," he explained as we walked toward the family cemetery. "Thought it was important." The small plot was well tended, enclosed by a wrought iron fence I didn't remember. Pa's gravestone stood weathered but readable, and beside it, newer but beginning to show signs of exposure. A marker for Ma. I hadn't been able to afford one during my brief return, had left only a wooden cross that should have rotted years ago. "Your father arranged it," Walsh explained, noting my confusion, before he passed. "Sent the money and specifications to my father. They corresponded for years, apparently." The revelation stunned me, that Pa, who barely wrote 3 sentences in his monthly letters to me, had maintained this connection, had ensured Ma would have a proper marker. Lillian moved forward, knelt by the stones, traced the engraved names with her fingertip. Her profile against the prairie sky was so like Ma's that my breath caught. Later that day, Walsh drove us to Crooked Creek, now bordered by a different fence, 3 strands of smooth wire rather than the barbed barrier that had caught Ma's shawl. The creek itself had changed course slightly over the decades, cutting deeper into the bank where her remains had been found. Standing there with Lillian, watching water flow over stones that might have witnessed Ma's final moments, I found myself telling the story again, not the sanitized version I'd shared in Lillian's childhood, but the full truth, with all its unanswered questions and haunting possibilities. She was trying to protect the animals, Lillian said when I finished, her voice thoughtful. Even knowing the risk. Not a question, but a statement. An understanding of character that transcended time and absence. Like you, with the barn restoration, creating shelter. The comparison startled me. I had never connected my obsessive rebuilding with Ma's final act. But the parallel resonated with undeniable truth. Both of us trying to preserve something valuable against destructive forces, regardless of personal cost. We spent a week at the Walsh farm. Days filled with exploration of places half remembered, nights with conversations that stretched toward dawn. I showed Lillian the boundaries of our original property, the spot where Pa had taught me to ride, the creek bend where I'd caught my first fish. Each location unlocked stories I hadn't realized I carried, memories preserved like insects in amber, intact despite decades of silence. Lillian absorbed everything, asking questions that sometimes required me to reconsider events from perspectives I'd never examined. On our final evening, Walsh suggested we might want to visit one last place, a ridge overlooking the property, where his father had often gone to watch weather moving across the prairie. The climb was gentle but long, the August sun hot on our backs as we followed a narrow trail through tall grass. At the summit, the view opened dramatically. Miles of cultivated fields interspersed with pasture, the ranch buildings miniaturized by distance, and beyond, the vast curve of the horizon meeting endless sky. "You can see everything from here," Walsh said, then tactfully moved away, leaving Lillian and me alone with the panorama. We stood in silence, watching shadows lengthen across the land as afternoon edged toward evening. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. The breeze carried scents of sun-warmed grass, distant water, the green promise of crops ripening toward harvest. "I understand now," Lillian said finally, her voice carrying the soft certainty that emerged when she had thought deeply about something. "Why you needed to come back. Why I needed to see it." She gestured toward the expanse before us. "This is part of me too, this place, what happened here. Grandmother Lillian's choice that night, your leaving, all of it. I couldn't know who I am without knowing this." Her words unlocked something that had remained knotted inside me for 30 years. Not just grief for Ma, but a deeper reconciliation with the entirety of my past. The prairie spread before us was neither enemy nor sanctuary, just the stage where our family's story had played out, one thread in the vast tapestry of human experience. The storm that took Ma was not malevolent, but simply nature following its own imperatives. Her death was tragic but not meaningless. She had died trying to protect what she valued, embodying the quiet courage that defined her life. As sunset painted the western sky in bands of gold and crimson, I put my arm around Lillian's shoulders, feeling the solid reality of her presence. Through her, something of Ma lived on. Not just physical resemblance, but essential qualities: determination, compassion, clear-sighted acceptance of life's harsh realities alongside its beauty. The continuity felt like a gift I had neither earned nor expected, but could finally, gratefully receive. We left Nebraska the following day, the return journey west, carrying us back toward the life we had built in Mendocino. Watching the landscape transform outside the train window, I realized I was traveling not away from the past, but with it, carrying memories no longer as burden but as inheritance, a legacy to be tended and eventually passed on. The red shawl, long since surrendered to ocean winds, had completed its purpose. Its fragments, like Ma's story, had become part of something larger, woven into the fabric of who Lillian was becoming, who I had managed to become despite, or perhaps because of, that winter night when everything changed. The train whistle sounded as we crossed the California border, its plaintive note echoing briefly before fading into distance. Lillian, dozing against my shoulder, stirred but didn't wake. I watched her face in repose, the woman she was becoming visible beneath lingering traces of childhood. Soon she would begin her own journey, moving toward horizons I could not see. But unlike Ma, whose final steps remained forever shrouded in blizzard darkness, Lillian's path stretched forward into possibility, unobstructed by the shadows that had for so long defined our family story. In that moment of clarity, somewhere between Nebraska memory and California future, I finally understood what the discovery of the shawl had given me. Not just closure or answers, but the freedom to recognize that life continues even after devastating loss. The barbed wire that had caught and preserved that fragment of red wool had marked not an ending but a turning point. The moment when absence began its slow transformation into different kinds of presence. Ma was gone, would always be gone, but the love that had sent her into that storm lived on, in me, in Lillian, in the stories we would continue to tell, in the choices we would make when facing our own metaphorical blizzards. The train continued westward, carrying us home.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.